Hi, my name is Stanislav Costiuc, and I'm a game designer. The patrons have voted to continue dissecting the Zelda series, so that's what we're gonna do. Next to the list is Zelda for Game & Watch, a somewhat obscure but very curious part of the franchise. There are two ways you can play it. Find an actual Game & Watch, even though that's gonna be highly difficult, or play it as a bonus game in Game & Watch Gallery 4 for Game Boy Advance, which is much more manageable. Only you should note that it is the very last unlock in that collection, so you will have to play practically everything else first. Nevertheless, while there is absolutely no gameplay difference, as of now the GBA release is the best way to play the game, so that's what we're gonna base our critique off. As always, in addition to the actual analysis, we will score the game for fun using my Stasocritic system. If you don't know what it is yet, the important thing is that we discuss and rate a game in 5 categories, and the first one is design. This category influences a game's score the most, as its weight is 4. The most important part of games is how interactivity is used to create a memorable experience, and that's the part we'll be focusing on in this section. Before we begin talking about the game proper, I need to explain the specificities of Game & Watch. These are handheld titles that, technically speaking, don't have graphics, but art drawn on their screens that lights up depending on what happens and what you do. This means that every mechanic, every action is literally limited by screen space. So from that perspective, it is understandable why the developers have decided to make the Game & Watch Zelda combat-focused, which becomes the main and only pillar. It is more feasible to draw the required art to create an arcade-like experience rather than something more exploratory, in which case you would need to have a really complicated combination of shapes that you could light up in different variations depending on what happens. So with that in mind, the core gameplay loop is also extremely straightforward. You need to avoid or block enemy attacks, while at the same time making sure to hit the enemy until you kill them. After you do so, we get into Zelda's structural loop. You defeat the enemy, receive a reward, and choose which room to go to next. Yes, the game still tries to recreate a part of the Zelda experience by essentially putting us in dungeons that we need to navigate around as we find treasures until eventually reaching a boss, defeating which gives us a Triforce piece. And all this is probably the game's biggest issue. It gets too overcomplicated for its own good. Usually Game & Watch titles tend to go for very simple yet compelling loops. And the core gameplay principle of Zelda is also very straightforward, but it tries to wrap it around a more complex progression, and even with 2 screens there is just not enough space for that to feel meaningful. As a result, it lacks flow and becomes monotone really fast. The screen that you will see the most will always have a moblin in there. That's who you have to defeat to progress. The moblin can either hit with his spear or throw it. There can be up to 5 other enemies, most of which are Stalfos that try to hit you from below, and a Guinea who sometimes pops up to shoot from the left side of the screen. As Link, you can walk on the left and right, as well as attack. And a nice touch is that hitting with your sword changes your shield position. So you have to time when you use the sword to block from the left side of the screen, while not leaving yourself vulnerable from attacks coming from the right. The way the game tries to add progression is by varying which enemies are on screen, adding more health to the moblin, and increasing the speed of enemy attacks every several dungeons. After you kill a moblin, you get a reward. It can be a piece of heart or a potion that fully heals you, and just like in other Zelda games, when you have full health, you shoot sword beams, which helps considerably. The reward can also be a map, which is absolutely useless. You never find information which room keeps which treasure anyway, you can't backtrack, and there is no way to miss the boss chamber. And then you can get a tomahawk, the only usage of which is to damage the boss faster. The boss fight itself happens on a second screen, or rather one half of it, and you just mash the dragon while avoiding his fireballs and tail attack, both of which again get faster and more intense with every dungeon. And that's the whole game. What you see is what you get. And what you get is fine, the design here is by no means bad, but by trying to cram so many things in, the game stands in an awkward spot. It's not simplistic enough that the whole point becomes just getting into the zone and going with the flow as you try to increase your high score, but it also is not deep enough to make progression and prolonged gameplay feel interesting. Literally wasted screen space doesn't help. For example, the map. Zelda doesn't need it. That screen space could have been freed up to add more attack patterns for the boss, so it wouldn't be just the same two over and over again, but different dragons could use different attacks with varying patterns. Or the Moblin fight, maybe you could remove one or two additional enemies to be able to make Moblin's behavior a bit more complex and not just rely on increasing his health. In later stages, even when the screen is full of enemies, you don't feel that engaged, but think when is this gonna end so you could go to the next screen. Zelda wanted to focus on progression, mimicking the journeys you do in the main franchise titles, but what it should have done to make it work is focus on adding more depth rather than a quantity of elements. So if we take a look at the scoring breakdown for design category, and I'm not gonna read what each number means, so feel free to pause if you want to check it all out, the best fitting rating for Zelda will be a 5. The design of the game is absolutely functional, but it tries to add too many things, thus not letting any of its mechanics shine. Now let's discuss the next category, context. This category is about everything that contextualizes players' actions, plot, world, characters, environments, etc. The weight of context is 1 because usually it is more about enhancing the experience rather than defining it. This is probably gonna be one of the shortest context breakdowns ever. You're Link, dragons have captured Zelda and want to destroy the world, you need to defeat the dragons and rescue Zelda. That's it. The manual doesn't provide any more flair either. So, time to choose a score for context then. I think it's a 3. There is really not much to it. Let's move on to aesthetics. Another category with the weight of 1 as it is something that again enhances the experience rather than defines it, but this time through visuals, sound and music. Here we'll have to contend with the fact that there is really not much the game could do with the format to be aesthetically pleasing. The GBA version doesn't really show it because of everything being essentially compressed into pixels, but the actual Game & Watch does have neat and pretty detailed drawings. And that's about it. No sound beyond beeps, no music, nothing else. And if we have to choose a single most fitting score, Zelda would have a 4. Through no fault of its own, again there's only so much you can do with a Game & Watch game, but it did what it could. Now let's talk about cohesion. This category is about how different elements of a game are combined together to create a wholesome experience, and the scores in it have a weight of 2. And this will be another really short breakdown it seems. Zelda for Game & Watch is a game. That's pretty much everything you can say about it. You can clearly see that some choices were made without any thought about how it fits together, but based on what could be drawn. For example, why is the tomahawk effective against dragons? How does that make sense? It doesn't, but the boss battle needs the weapon to have 2 parts, so you could light up only one or both depending on what you have. That's it, that's the reason. And if there is a score that fits most stuff like this, it's a 5. Yes, the game tries to recreate the feeling of a Zelda game, but by and large, the choices have been led by the need for the mechanics to be functional. And it's time to talk about the final Stasocritic category, emotions. The most subjective part of my scoring system, and yet with the second biggest weight, 3. That's because regardless of how well the game is made, that doesn't mean anything if you don't enjoy it. And let's just show the score breakdown from the get-go because there is not a lot to talk about this time. It's a 3. I was bored. I played the game for 30 minutes, enjoyed the first 5-10 at most, and then realized that I'm not getting anything else out of it and it just bored me. So there's that. Let's conclude our video. If we calculate all ratings and their weights together, Zelda gets a score of 36. If you are interested in this pretty obscure part of Zelda history, you can try to find it. Otherwise, I wouldn't really recommend it. You might be able to enjoy it for its arcadey gameplay, but I don't really think that it will grab anyone for a considerable amount of time. I'm actually surprised that this game didn't see an enhanced remake in the Game & Watch gallery. A lot of those games were redone in these collections with additional mechanics that were not possible before, better graphics, all while keeping the original Game & Watch feeling. Zelda would be one of the games benefiting the most from such a remake, as its progression could become much more interesting and less tied to screen space. But so far there is only the original version available, and for me it was pretty boring despite being adequate in its design. At any rate, if you have played this title, be sure to comment below and don't forget to like and subscribe. A special thank you goes to all my patrons. The support helps a lot, and if you're interested in my content, consider checking out patreon.com/parlance. My patrons can vote for what games to talk about next, have access to a Discord server, and can get early access to scripts and videos. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.